July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence. We know this day as the very first Independence Day. It is now an American holiday associated with food, fun, family, and fireworks. Lots of fireworks. It's a day when we celebrate what's important. It's a day when we celebrate this nation's freedom. It is also a chance for us to focus on another freedom that we have. A freedom given to us not by our founding fathers, but by our Heavenly Father. So as we take time to celebrate our nation's independence and freedom, let's also pause and thank God for our spiritual freedom from sin, shame, and fear. A freedom that has been made possible by Jesus.
Kings and kingdoms will bow down, and every chain will break as broken hearts declare His praise. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before Him. So open up the gates, make way before the King of Kings. Our God who calls to save is here to set the captives free. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before Him. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? 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 Who can stop the Lord? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before Him. Our
them today. Let them hear your voice.
Good morning and welcome to the Rivers online worship experience. My name is Dean Ward and I'm the lead pastor of the River Church, and I'm so grateful that you have chosen to join in with us here today. Now maybe you're saying, well, Pastor Dean, where have you been? Well, my wife and I, as I mentioned at the end of the sermon 4 weeks ago, were blessed to be able to take a 3-week trip to celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary that we celebrated last year. So we were celebrating our 31st wedding anniversary, and it was a great time. We went to my wife's favorite place on earth. We went to Italy for 3 weeks, and we spent a week in 3 different areas of Italy, and I've never seen my wife so happy. And if my wife can be happier than she's ever been 31 years into our marriage, it's a win. So grateful for just the grace of our church and the way everybody stepped up, and especially Brian Baker, our associate pastor, and the way he carried the load and preached for the 3 weeks, and just so blessed to be the pastor of the River. Also, when we came home, I was welcomed by this beautiful smoky air. It was not happening over in Italy at all. And when we landed in Pittsburgh, it was at nighttime. I didn't notice it the next morning. I woke up and I'm like, what is going on? And then later that day, I watched the news for the first time in about 3 weeks and saw the smoke that is just affecting our area and creating havoc on the air quality and conditions. So if it looks a little hazy outside, it's not because it's early Sunday morning and you're in a fog. It really is hazy. 9.58 seconds. That's the world record for the 100-meter dash that Usain Bolt broke the record in 2009 at the athletic championships held in Berlin. And he shattered the previous records, and it's a world record that he has held now for 14 years. 9.58 seconds. he ran 100 meters. That's fast. I mean, that is so incredibly fast. And it's easy to look at that and celebrate that he accomplished that he did that. And we could think, man, that's just awesome. And it is very impressive. And Usain Bolt will always be remembered for that world record that he holds along with a couple others. He'll be remembered for that and his victory pose. Remember his victory pose? Okay, that was a pathetic attempt to look by. Okay, Matt, on the screen, can you show us what it really looks like, please? Thank you. You know, Usain Bolt did not just show up and wake up the morning of the competition and say, I think I'm going to break a world record. He didn't just decide to do it that morning. He trained and planned and worked for years. And it's so easy to look at that world record and celebrate that. But it's so easy to forget and overlook all that went into his success that allowed him to accomplish that world record. We are in week 4 of our sermon series, just simply called Old School Bible School. I haven't said it yet. Old School Sunday School, revisiting flannel graph favorites. And Pastor Brian, the past 3 weeks, has taken a look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then the life of Jonah, and then last week, Elijah and the prophet of Baal. And one of the hopes in this series is that we're able to look at these childhood favorites through adult eyes, through a different perspective, and we're able to look at them differently. So today, we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. And in 1 Samuel 17 is the famous story of David and Goliath. Now, I'm just going to give you a little heads up. Spoiler alert. You may want to turn the volume down if you don't want me to spoil how the story goes. But David wins, Goliath loses, and we celebrate the victory. And for generations, we've taught this story to children, young children. And one of the overarching themes that we draw out in the lives of young children is that God is bigger than your giants, and God can help you win over your giants. He can help you win the battles that you will face in life. I have in 2 weeks, I will have a 4-year-old grandson. Right now, he's 3 years old. And his Aunt Abby told him last week that when he's 14 years old, he's allowed to watch Godzilla. Now, I have no idea how his aunt decided that he's allowed to watch the movie Godzilla and how she decided on this arbitrary age of 14. But he came home and let his mom know, hey, when I'm 14 years old, I'm going to get to watch Godzilla because Aunt Abby told me so. He was so excited about the ability to face this giant on screen in the movie. Well, I wish that would be the first giant he would get to experience. But next year, he's going to go to preschool, and the following year, he's going to go to kindergarten, and then he's going to start sports, and he's going to be involved and meet new friends, and he's going to face giants every step of the way. So when we teach this lesson to children, we take the time to let them know that even in the midst of the things that you might be afraid of, if you trust God, He can help you have victory over your giants. But today, I would like to look at it from a little bit different perspective. I'd like to look at David's victory over Goliath and focus on what all went into his life that ensured he would have victory over Goliath. How did he live his young life? How did he train? What values did he have? What decisions did he make that enabled him to be victorious on that day. So with that said, let's jump into 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now, we're going to look at how David prepared for this moment, but we can't do it without telling the story. And I find that when I tell the Bible story and instead of reading the Bible story, I leave out a lot of important information. This is an extremely long story, 55 some verses. So I've trimmed it down. My camera guy who edits and puts in the Bible verses is about to lose his mind because he realizes he's going to have a lot of verses to post in the lower third. But here we go. These are the highlights of the story. 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war. Saul and the Israelites assembled and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. A champion named Goliath came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. So Goliath was tall. Now, when I was a kid and asked how tall Goliath was, my mother would always tell me, according to the measurements, Goliath was 9 feet tall, 9 inches. And I just always remember that, 9 feet, 9 inches. And I'm like, that's so tall. Can you imagine? Well, one of the dinners that we were having on vacation, my wife and I went to this restaurant, and I saw this group of 4 come in, and they sat at the table next to us. And I saw this guy that was so tall, I said to my wife, I think he might be a professional athlete. Well, they sat down next to us, and they started talking, and they were speaking great English, so I knew they were probably from around my neck of the woods and not over in Italy. And so I asked them, I said, where are you guys from? And they said, Salt Lake City, Utah. And I'm like, oh, wow. And then I had a thought, well, why don't I take a chance and Google Utah Jazz roster and see if this guy matches anybody on their roster. And about the 4th person in on the roster, there it was, Kelly Olynyk. He's 6 feet 11. He's 32 years old. He's played for several NBA teams, and many of you may know who he is. Here's a picture of him. And he was sitting right next to me. I'm like, wow, this guy's tall. I didn't get weird. I didn't ask him for his autograph. I respected their privacy. We had some nice interactions. But he was tall. Now, recent measurement estimations from that time and from that region says that Goliath was probably only 7 foot 10 inches tall. But I got to tell you, if you're 6 foot 11 like Kelly is, 7 foot 10 or 9 foot 9, you're tall. You're imposing. You are impressively sized. So Goliath was tall. Verse 8 says, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why do you come up and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. The Philistines said, this day I defy the armies of God. Give me a man and let us fight each other. On hearing this, Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. They were scared. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and took his stand. Do you got the image? Okay. Well, Jesse said to his son David, take this ephod of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are doing and bring back some assurance from them. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. Now, this brings me to the first thing that I want to show you that David did to prepare for victory. You ready? David brought the cheese. Now, I didn't say David cut the cheese. I said David brought the cheese. You see, God uses unlikely people who are just faithful, obedient, and willing. They may not seem spectacular in size or stature. They're just bringing the cheese. I think what gets lost in this story is that David was just showing up with the cheese as his father had asked him to do. His father said, hey, I need you to go do this. And David didn't throw a pout and say, no, I don't want to. I don't feel like it. I'm not going to do it. He said, okay, I'll do whatever you say, Dad. Sure, I'll do it. I like the way Luke chapter 16, verse 10 in the Good News translation says, whoever is faithful in small matters will be faithful in large ones. Whoever is dishonest in small matters will be dishonest in large ones. God is looking for people who will just bring the cheese, who will just do what they're asked to do, who show up and serve and bless and help with a good attitude, and they're just willing to do what God invites them to do. God values when we do what we're supposed to do. Verse 22, David left his things with the keeper of the supplies. So he got to the place. He left his things with the guy who keeps the supplies. He ran to the battle lines and asked his brothers how they were. He was doing what his father asked him to do. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now listen to how this lands on his three older brothers. When David's oldest brother heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Wow. That's some pretty strong brotherly love going on right there. I love David's reply in verse 29. Now what have I done, said David. Can't I even speak? What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul replied, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, but he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. David, he fiercely protected, and he trusted in God. He didn't live in fear. He didn't live in fear of his foes, whether it was a lion or a bear or a Philistine. He trusted in God. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. I want to invite you to watch this video to give us a little context, just simply called 5 Smooth Stones. I want to make sure that you understand that this story in 1 Samuel 17 has tremendous ramifications for your life. Tremendous lessons that you can learn. Things that David does in this story and in his life that will prepare you for whatever you face. I want to invite you to read this story in its entirety, just one chapter, 1 Samuel 17. I want you to read it. And I would like to invite you to read it every day for the next week. And just read it, and read it, and read it, and allow our God, the God of this story, to speak to you relating to all that you are facing in your life. Let's pick the story back up in verse 38. So Saul basically gave David the keys to the kingdom and said, okay, you can do it. Go ahead. Here you go. Verse 38, then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I love this. David says, I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Now, I just want to pause there, and I want to invite you to think of the courage of David when told by Saul, the king of Israel, that he could go fight this giant as long as he used his armor and his weaponry. And David tried it on. David tried. And then he said, look, I can't do it your way. I'm a shepherd. I'm good with a slingshot. I've destroyed a bear and a lion. I can do this, but let me do it in a way that's congruent with who I am. Let me do it in a way that matches who God created me to be. I haven't been trained in all this warfare the way you guys have with all this stuff. Let me just go with my slingshot. Can you think of the boldness that David had to have this conversation with Saul? Verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with the sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Now, I have a friend who's gone over to Israel. Actually, it's Pastor Mark. He's gone over to Israel, and he's been told that at this creek that the tour guides actually put stones in there for the tourists to come and say, look, I got a stone out of the creek, just like David did, facing the giant, facing Goliath. So David just went and got what he... Now, if you think these stones were just little itty-bitty pebbles, here's a picture of what the historians believe these 5 smooth stones would have looked something like this. These were the kind of stones that they used with their slingshots back in the day. Get hit in the head with one of those, that'll leave a mark. Leslie and I, when we were in Italy, had the sincere privilege of being able to go to Florence and tour the museum where Michelangelo's sculpture, David, is on display. And this was a very moving experience. And this statue of David that he carved is not the height and stature of David. It's actually 17 feet tall. So it's twice the size that Goliath was. And yet, very subtly, there's a slingshot in David's one hand and a stone tucked away in his other hand as Michelangelo brought together this story of David about to face Goliath in that sculpture. Verse 41. It's about to get real. You ready to go? Here we go. Verse 41. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. he looked at David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. Oh, we're filming under a bridge and a car just drove over the bridge. A little jarring, sorry about that. Goliath said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." Now, Goliath was engaging in amazing trash talk. He was like, I'm gonna get in his face, I'm gonna call him out, I'm gonna intimidate him, I'm gonna scare him, I'm gonna put the fear in him. It didn't work. Verse 45, David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled." I love David's tone in this. His confidence, his certainty that God will allow him to be victorious. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." Now this little Israelite boy, he's doing his own trash talking. He's letting him have it. "This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Now, I don't know if Goliath was quaking in his sandals or his boots, if he was shaking in his boots at those words, but he should have been. Verse 48. And the Philistine moved closer to attack him. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down into the ground. David gave Goliath the ultimate concussion. I mean, that stone sank into his forehead. He lost consciousness, collapsed, fell face down on the ground. That reminds me, I believe it's that Mike Tyson quote that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Goliath just got punched in the face, or a stone sunk into his forehead. Verse 50. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. In the few minutes that we have left, I want to just draw out some of the things that enabled David to do what David did. What characteristics brought him victory? David didn't get to this moment by accident. He was ready for this moment when it came. It's not about the 9.58 seconds that we have where all the glory and the hype is, but it's in the training, in the preparedness. Now, let's speculate. Now, this is just only speculation. But how much time do you really think it took when the Philistines started running toward him and David was running toward Goliath, and David took the slingshot and took that stone and hurled it and hit Goliath in the forehead? How much time do you really think it took? I imagine maybe less than 10 seconds. Maybe it was all over quicker than anybody ever saw coming, like Mike Tyson's early fights, where they thought he would just knock somebody out in the first round. Let's speculate that it only took 9.58 seconds. And just for the sake of illustration, let's imagine that. He ran toward him. He struck him with the stone. It was a very brief moment of time, but so much time in his life preparing. How many times do you think he had thrown a stone with a slingshot? How much effort and energy and time do you think this young boy had into mastering the tool that gave him the ultimate victory? Now, it's interesting to me that most of these Israelite army type, most of the soldiers, they would have known how to use a slingshot. But they got squeezed into the mold that they only could do it one way. They thought it could only be done with a sword or a spear. But David proved we have what we need to face the battles. Most of the Israelite army, they would have been followers of God. They would have known that God was a victorious God. They could have lived with the victory that David had. But none of them saw it. None of them envisioned it. None of them dared to think that they could win that battle. So it took an innocent, young, maybe naive, but not terribly naive. He'd already killed a lion and a bear. It took a young boy trusting God to show just how great God is. He overcame his obstacles. He was the youngest of 8. He had 7 older siblings. He overcame that. I love how the scripture says he did not let other people's opinion of him sway him from who he was in God. When his brother was trash talking him and saying, I know how arrogant you are. You're a spoiled little brat. You come down here. You just came because you wanted the glory and experiencing this and the battle. You know, I know you didn't really come just because Dad told you to. You were probably at home begging him to come. And David's like, what did I do? And yet he didn't let that taunting from his brothers dissuade him. He never had any military training. David didn't even have a sword. He just had his staff and slingshot. And yet he alerted Goliath confidently that he would cut off his head. But it's not like David went out there unarmed. He had a slingshot with 5 stones. David was prepared. Some people have asked, why did David have 5 stones? And the dad joke that many preachers says, well, it's because Goliath had 4 brothers. But that's just a joke. Perhaps David thought, well, man, if I don't get him with the first one, I better be ready with the second one. Or maybe he thought, when I take care of this Philistine, maybe their armies will come and rush after me, and I need to be better prepared with more stones. Preparation for facing the battle of his life. That's not much of the story that our kids are taught, and yet, as adults, it's one that we can learn from. David is agile and quick. He knew his advantage was in God and his agility and quickness. David was obedient in the non-glamorous things he was asked to do. He trusted God. He was still tending the sheep, even though he'd already been anointed by Samuel. He was still bringing the cheese. David had a deep trust in the Lord, was confident his God, the one true God, would be victorious. Now, part of why I want you to read this story is because I want you to allow the Holy Spirit to point out to you maybe where you might be acting like or having the attitude like the soldiers of Israel who followed the same God, who had the same training David did with a slingshot, and yet they cowered in fear from what was facing them, taunting them. And I want to invite you to consider living your life with the innocent trust in a trustworthy God. I would like to invite you to look back in your life at how God came through for you at different times in your life, how he came through for you at different periods that maybe you have forgotten, because David didn't forget. God was faithful to him and allowed him to be victorious over the bear and the lion, and David's like, hey, I won these battles before, I can do it this time as well. And it's my hope that when your 9.58 second opportunity comes, that you will be victorious because you are prepared and you trust and you don't shrink back in fear, but you move forward in faith in the living God. God bless you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us with us today. Can't wait till I get to see you again next Sunday. God bless.